Um, Hello, we are here in the Research Highlights series with Sylvie Lambert from Paris School of Economics. Thank you very much for being here with us today. And we would like you to tell us a bit about your presentation in the Nova Africa Research Seminar, for us to understand your research.
Okay, so the paper I presented today is on inequality in Senegal and on intra-household allocation of resources. The idea is that to study whether allocation of resources is equal or unequal within households as well as between households, to try to assess the importance of these within households inequality and the consequences of these within households inequality on poverty. Because indeed, it's fairly intuitive to think that households that are relatively near the poverty threshold, if they have inequality within the household, it might lead some members of the households to pass below this arbitrary threshold that is the poverty line. And in which case, you will have some individuals that should be qualified as poor, living in households that might not be poor, so that might be missed out. So in fact, that's what we find. But in order to do this, we use a survey that we have designed for the purposes of trying to understand family structure and intra-household resource allocation, where we collect consumption data at the infra-household level. So we don't only go to, as most standard survey, to the household head and ask about the consumption on a given list of items. What we do is we collect separately common consumption and then consumption for each subgroups in the household, where a subgroup would be a sort of budgetary unit led by one person and including as well all the dependents of that person. So for example, a woman and her children. And so at the level of each of these cells, of each of these subgroup, if you want, we ask we collect consumption data concerning this particular subgroup. So as a result, we can have a relatively individualized measure of consumption where we attribute to each group its share of the common expenditure and the expenditure that concerns only that group as collected in the survey. And that will be the way we are going to use to assess intra-household inequality. So now by doing this, what we do is we collect consumption in a way that's very disaggregated compared to what a standard household surveys do. First, because we ask more than one respondent, and because for each type of item we ask separately consumption of, transportation or telephone minutes or clothing for the household head, for his first wife, for his second wife, for the cousin who lives here. So it's extremely disaggregated. There are previous experiments on the impact of survey design on measurement that shows that the more disaggregated consumption questions are, the higher the level of consumption recorded. So as expected, with our survey that is very disaggregated, we find indeed a level of consumption that is higher than what a very standard consumption survey that was carried out in the same country just the previous year finds. We find the consumption that's 30% higher. But interestingly, we have the same share of poor using the same poverty line. So if we compare the poverty diagnostic using the same poverty line, we are fairly similar. So it's different, but it's not happening at the bottom end of the distribution. And so what is happening is that for households that are relatively richer, that are non-poor, and that are probably those that have several sources of income and that probably have consumption that can be a bit more private, we collect more consumption. Why is it likely to be the case? Because the household structure in Senegal is such that you have very extended households, and in these households, not all income are public and not all consumptions are public. And as a result, if you ask only one person, you'll not be able to list everything. So we probably miss more consumption when we ask only one person for households that are relatively rich, that have probably more source of income or source of transfer than for poor households. That might explain why we find no difference for poverty, while the average consumption is 30% higher. So obviously, if we don't change the bottom of the distribution, but we change the rest of the distribution, what we're doing is we're stretching the distribution. So inequality assessment is probably different from what is obtained from a standard survey. And indeed, the standard survey conducted the previous year gives a Gini of 0.4, while in our survey, we have a Gini of 0.54. It's a completely different world. 0.54 is the range of any Latin American country or a country from the austral part of Africa, and is not at all the common range for West African countries, which are supposed to be in the 40 or 0.4. And this is assuming no intra-household inequality. By this I mean that I add all the components of consumption that I detailed earlier, and I divide it by the number of people in the household, and I have a per capita household measure of consumption. And if I, ignore the intra-household inequality, I still have a Gini of 54. Now, if in addition I take into account the intra-household inequality by attributing to each individual his per capita cell consumption, the Gini reach 56.4. So that might not seem a lot, but Gini is not a decomposable measure of inequality, so I can try to look at the tail index that I can decompose, and that still signal that the intra-household inequality is 16% of total inequality. 16%. It's already quite a lot. Which is completely ignored if you don't do that. So we test whether this could be due to measurement error. This is not the case. We try to compare it with what would be the maximum intra-household inequality, given that you have a sort of constrained share of consumption, meaning food, shelter, that is very high, on average nearly 70%. And we find that the maximum intra-household inequality would be 26%. So, 16 out of 26% is quite a lot. This has consequences on poverty indeed. And we find that there are a number of poor individuals or poor cells that live in non-poor households. And so somehow, if we were to target a policy at the poor, we would miss those guys. So there are the poor hidden in non-poor households, and they account for 12.5% of the poor. And it's, if I take the thing the other way, it's 8% of the non-poor households are in fact hosting poor individuals. So I think, so it would mean that if we target on the basis of a poverty status defined at the household consumption level, we would probably mistarget some of the poor. I mean, and the mistargeting that's serious, which means missing some guys who need help. Mm-hmm. Now, to mitigate this result, if we look at the poverty gap separately of different types of poor, those who live in households that are entirely poor and those who live in non-poor households, those who live in non-poor households are less poor than those who live in households that are all poor. Mm-hmm. They are obviously, because these households on average are closer to the poverty line. So they are closer to the poverty line, so that mitigates slightly the issue of mistargeting. I think that's about the core of the paper.
Thank you very much. So talking about inequality within household, is this only about consumption, or are there other outcomes you look at to talk about inequality like health or education?
No, in this paper we only look at consumption. Mm-hmm. This is a way to really look at the inequality at the country level, because include all the households in that distribution. If we were to use other outcomes, first, we don't have that many in the survey, but for example, we could look at educational outcome. But then, if households have kids or are members of different age, they live in a very different environment in terms of education, because Senegal, as many poor countries, have witnessed huge progress in education due to, in particular, to the effort to meet the Millennium Development Goals. And, the younger generations are much more educated than the older ones. So if the kids are younger, they're more likely to be educated, and that has nothing to do really I mean, it's not the same sort of inequality as the one we want to measure. We could look at, nutritional outcomes like body mass index or whatever, but we don't have these data for everyone. We only have it for very young children. And again, households with very young children are many households, but not all of the households. So that would mean we exclude a lot of households from our analysis. So in this paper, we only look at consumption inequality.
Okay, thank you. And is there any policy implication that we could think of from this paper? Is there any intervention that could mitigate inequality within households?
So there are policy implications, but for inequality within households, I'm not sure. Because to think that it has policy implications, you need to think that somehow inequality within the household is a problem that is different, that is more serious than inequality in general. Which means something like, if my cousin who is poor lives in a household that's different from me, so he's poorer than me, lives in another household, it's less of a problem that he's poorer than me, but he lives in my household because I provide him food and shelter and nothing else. So he's still poorer than me, and now he lives in my household. So it turns into within household inequality, and that would be a more serious problem. I'm not sure. I mean, it's not completely obvious to me that we should consider that issue as a specific problem. I think it's a problem because then you underestimate inequality. And in a fairly important way, if I think of 16% of inequality that I miss, so I underestimate inequality. So the policy implication is more that. But whether I need to intervene within households, I don't know. Now, probably if you wanted to do something, it would affect inequality in general anyway, and it would be to try to target those individuals that are vulnerable within households. And clearly there will be marginal members. So it's not the nucleus. So it is the cousin that comes and lives with you. It's your sister that comes and lives with you with her child. So these are those marginal members that aggregate to the household because they, need the protection of these households, the food and shelter again. And so any policy that would target unemployment, lone mothers, whatever, would probably also decrease intra-household inequality, but it would increase inequality in general.
Okay. And the results from these kind of surveys are different. This survey are different from the standard survey because some parts of the household hide some money to the head, and that's why in the standard surveys consumption is underestimated. Why do people hide consumption within households?
So two things. First thing, that's one of the reasons. Mm-hmm. It's a guess. Mm-hmm. The other reason is just that if you have a very big household, some of these households are huge. I mean, there are 40% have 3 cells or more. Mm-hmm. And, the household head, even if he knew, might not remember all the beauty products bought by the sister of his wife who lives in the household or whatever. And he might not be able to recall all the expenditures of everyone. How many phone minutes his wife bought. He doesn't know, and he probably doesn't care, even if somehow it's out of the money he gave her. Okay, mm-hmm. So that's one reason as well that should not be underestimated. Now, income hiding is extremely frequent, and we know that there have been experiments in this particular context, and in other contexts. And it's the main reason is because people want to be able to resist claims by family members, claims by legitimate, legitimate demands. If your brother asks you to send him money to pay for the medical bills of his children, it's very difficult to refuse. And, you might feel that he exaggerates the bills, and sometimes it might even be true, and you might not want to give that much. And so you want to be able to say, sorry, I can't do it. And so you need to hide to make sure you can't do it. It has been documented in this context and in other contexts with, for example, people taking loans just to be able to say, look, I have a loan to reimburse. Sorry, I can't help you. So this happens a lot. It happens within households also because women want to have their own expenditure, want to put money aside for themselves in particular, for the case, they'll become widow and they'll have, they'll inherit hardly anything, and so they'll need resources for themselves. So the typical example, when they can, is they build their own house to make sure they have somewhere to live.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks.